The Army told the men assigned to fly the CH-47 Chinook that they were operating the most capable heavy-lift helicopter in the American inventory. By 1966, the Chinook had become the single most hunted rotary-wing aircraft in Vietnam, large enough to see from 3 kilometers, slow enough to track, and loaded with enough fuel and ordnance to produce a fireball visible from the next valley when a North Vietnamese .51 caliber round found the right place in the airframe. That gap between what the Army's aviation doctrine claimed the Chinook was and what the skies over Vietnam revealed it to be is where the experience of the men who flew and crewed it actually lived. The Boeing Verdal CH-47A Chinook that arrived in Vietnam in 1965 with the 1st Cavalry Division was not a fighter. It was not designed to survive in contested airspace. It was designed to move things. Artillery pieces, ammunition pallets, downed aircraft, troops, fuel blivets, supplies, across distances and in quantities that smaller helicopters could not manage. Its tandem rotor configuration, with a forward rotor and an aft rotor, each measuring 60 feet in diameter and counter-rotating to cancel torque without a tail rotor, was the engineering solution that gave it a cargo hook capacity of 20,000 pounds and an internal payload of 28 combat-equipped troops, or the equivalent weight in cargo. It was 99 feet long from rotor hub to rotor hub, longer than some of the fixed-wing aircraft operating out of the same airstrips. It displaced enough air that the rotor wash at hover produced a dust cloud visible for miles in the dry season and a spray visible for miles in the wet season. It was, in other words, visible, at all times, in all conditions, from distances that the weapons the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong carried could reach. The Army's aviation doctrine of the early 1960s had anticipated this problem in the abstract and addressed it with the assumption that the Chinook would operate primarily in rear areas and at altitudes that kept it above the effective range of small arms fire. Vietnam's geography and the nature of the war it produced invalidated both assumptions before the first Chinook had completed its first month of in-country operations. There were no rear areas in the sense the doctrine required. There was no altitude that was simultaneously safe from ground fire and useful for a helicopter delivering a 105mm howitzer to a fire support base cut into a ridgeline in the Central Highlands. The Chinook went where the mission required, at the altitude the terrain demanded. And the doctrine's assumptions went with it into the same irrelevance that Vietnam produced for so many things written at desks in Washington and Fort Rucker. Start with the machine and its specific physical character, because the CH-47's dimensions and capabilities define simultaneously what it could do and what it cost the men inside it to do it in the environment Vietnam produced. The CH-47As, 2 Lycoming T-55 L7 turboshaft engines, each producing 2,200 shaft horsepower, were mounted in pods on either side of the rear pylon, external to the fuselage, accessible in flight through a narrow crawlway, and positioned in a location that put them in the direct line of fire from any weapon engaging the aircraft from the rear quarter. The engines drove the 2 rotors through a combining gearbox in the fuselage and a series of drive shafts running the length of the aircraft, a mechanical system of considerable complexity that the CH-47B and C models progressively refined, but that in the early variants presented maintenance challenges that the tropical heat, the monsoon humidity, and the operational tempo of the airmobile concept had not been part of the design parameters. A T-55 engine running at full power in 95-degree Fahrenheit ambient temperature at high altitude in the Central Highlands was not operating in the conditions its specification sheets described. It was operating at the edge of what the thermal margins permitted, and the flight engineers and mechanics who kept those engines running under those conditions were improvising solutions to degradation problems that the technical manuals had not anticipated in the specific form that Vietnam's environment produced them. The cockpit sat forward of the front rotor at the extreme nose of the aircraft, a position that gave the 2 pilots exceptional forward and lateral visibility, and that positioned them at the point of the aircraft farthest from the engines, the cargo, and the fuel. It also positioned them closest to whatever the aircraft was flying toward which, on approach to a hot landing zone in 1966 and 1967, was the concentrated ground fire of every weapon in range that could be brought to bear on a 99-foot helicopter descending through effective small arms altitude at 120 knots. The cockpit's armor was limited. The windscreen was not ballistic glass in the early variants. The two pilots were the most exposed men on the aircraft at the moment of maximum exposure, which was the approach to the landing zone, which was the purpose of every mission. The crew chief and the door gunners, typically one crew chief and two gunners on combat missions, armed with M60 machine guns, or later, M134 miniguns and door mounts, occupied the fuselage, managing the cargo, monitoring the hook load on external lift missions, and providing suppressive fire during approaches and departures. The crew chief's specific relationship with the aircraft was different from the pilots in a way that every account of CH-47 service emphasizes. The crew chief knew the aircraft's mechanical condition, with an intimacy the pilots depended on, and that no instrument panel fully conveyed. A crew chief who had spent 60 hours on a specific aircraft knew the sound its combining gearbox made when the lube oil temperature was 2 degrees above normal. He knew the vibration signature of the aft rotor when blade track was slightly off. He knew what normal felt like in his hands and his feet and the base of his skull where the airframe's vibration transmitted through the crew seat. And he knew when normal had shifted into something that required attention before it became something that required a crash investigation. The CH-47 vibrated. All helicopters vibrate. The nature of rotary wing flight produces vibration that no design fully eliminates. But the Chinook's tandem rotor system, with two 60-foot rotors operating in aerodynamic interaction with each other through the fuselage they shared, produced a vibration spectrum that the crews described with a specificity suggesting it was one of the defining physical characteristics of serving on the aircraft. Not uncomfortable, most of them said. You stopped noticing the baseline vibration within days, but present. Always present. Transmitted through every surface the body contacted. Accumulated over 8-hour duty days of multiple missions into a fatigue that expressed itself as physical exhaustion, disproportionate to the visible activity of sitting in a crew seat or a door gunner's position, because the body had been vibrating at the Chinook's characteristic frequency for 8 hours, and the muscular effort of maintaining stability against that vibration was work that the body performed without being instructed to and billed for at the end of the day. The numbers that define what CH-47 operations in Vietnam actually cost, as opposed to what the Airmobile Doctrine's architects projected they would cost, require their specific concentrated accounting here, because they establish the scale of the institutional miscalculation with a precision that general description cannot achieve. Between 1965 and 1972, the Army lost 161 CH-47 Chinooks in Southeast Asia to all causes. Of the approximately 750 Chinooks that served in Vietnam across all variants and operational periods, roughly 1 in 5 was destroyed before the aircraft's operational role was transitioned to South Vietnamese forces under Vietnamization. The loss rate concentrated in specific operational contexts. External load missions in contested terrain, where the aircraft's hover profile and reduced speed made it a stationary or near-stationary target at altitudes where every weapon the enemy carried was effective. Combat assault support missions, where the Chinook was used to move artillery pieces and ammunition to fire support bases that the tactical situation had already made hot before the aircraft arrived. And aircraft recovery missions, the specific CH-47 role that no other helicopter could perform, and that required the Chinook to hover over a downed aircraft in terrain that was almost never secure, at altitudes dictated by the terrain, rather than by any consideration of crew survivability. The aircraft recovery mission deserves specific attention because it captures the essential paradox of CH-47 operations in Vietnam with a completeness that the cargo haul and the combat assault support missions do not. When a helicopter went down in Vietnam, and between 1962 and 1973, the Army lost approximately 5,086 helicopters to all causes in Southeast Asia. The loss of the airframe was a logistical problem that the Army's aviation maintenance system was under sustained institutional pressure to minimize. A downed UH-1 or OH-6 that could be recovered, returned to a maintenance facility, and restored to flyable condition was an airframe that did not have to be replaced through a procurement system already strained by the war's consumption rate. The CH-47 was the only aircraft in the Army's inventory capable of recovering most downed helicopters. It could lift a UH-1 on its cargo hook, stabilize it beneath the fuselage, and fly it to a maintenance facility in a single lift. What it could not do was make this operation safe in the terrain and tactical conditions where most helicopters went down. A CH-47 hovering over a downed aircraft in a jungle clearing in the Central Highlands, at an altitude determined by the trees surrounding the clearing rather than by any tactical preference, with the aircraft stationary, because hovering with a hook load requires the aircraft to remain over the load until the load is secured and lifted. For the 2 to 8 minutes required for the crew chief to descend on the rescue hoist, attach the recovery sling, and signal for the lift, was a CH-47 at maximum vulnerability for a sustained period in terrain that the enemy used for exactly the tactical purposes the terrain's cover and concealment supported. The crews who flew aircraft recovery missions understood this. The missions were flown anyway because the Army needed the airframes recovered, and because the CH-47 was what the Army had. The external load mission, the routine cargo delivery that was the CH-47's primary justification and most common employment, imposed its own specific operational demands that the training syllabus at Fort Rucker had addressed in the abstract, and that Vietnam's terrain produced in the concrete form that distinguished the abstract from the operational. A CH-47, delivering a 105mm howitzer to a fire support base on a ridgeline in Quang Tri Province in 1967, was executing a mission that required the pilot to fly the aircraft to a hover over the gun position at an altitude determined by the trees and the ridgeline, often 30 to 60 feet above the intended placement point, with the aircraft in an attitude dictated by the terrain's wind shadow, the weight of the slung load affecting the aircraft's dynamic stability, and the crew chief providing hookup guidance over the interphone while watching the load's behavior beneath the aircraft, and the pilots watching instruments and terrain simultaneously. The placement of the load required the aircraft to descend to a height where the howitzer's wheels could contact the ground, hold that hover while the artillery crew released the slings, and then accelerate away with the abruptness that the tactical situation, a hot landing zone, a ridgeline the enemy was observing, an aircraft that had been stationary for 90 seconds, required. The transition from hover to forward flight in a CH-47 carrying maximum payload at high-density altitude, the combination of high temperature and high elevation that reduced the air density the rotors were working against, was a performance calculation that the crews made before every mission, and that the margin of error Vietnam's terrain and loading requirements produced was narrower than the calculation's input variables. In the field, in the operational tempo of 1966 and 1967, always permitted pilots to be certain about. CH-47 that committed to a hover in a mountain clearing at maximum gross weight and discovered that the density altitude was higher than forecast, or that the load was heavier than the manifest stated, which was a documented occurrence in the Delta and the Highlands with a frequency that the aviation safety officers tracked, had limited options. It could jettison the load. It could attempt to fly out of the clearing with insufficient power margin. The crews made these decisions in real time with the information available, which was never all the information the decision required. The fire that killed CH-47 crews and destroyed CH-47 airframes in the largest numbers was not always the enemy's. The CH-47's fuel system, internal fuel cells totaling approximately 1,030 gallons of JP4 jet fuel in the early variants, distributed in cells beneath the cargo floor and in sponsons along the fuselage sides, was a design feature that the aircraft's designers had addressed with self-sealing cells and careful placement away from the most likely penetration angles. It was not a design feature that made a CH-47 taking .51 caliber heavy machine gun fire through the fuselage immune to fire. The .51 caliber, the Soviet-designed DSHK heavy machine gun, or its Chinese equivalent that the North Vietnamese Army positioned in prepared firing positions along known helicopter approach corridors, fired a round capable of penetrating the CH-47's fuselage, the self-sealing fuel cells, and the engine compartment from ranges up to 2,000 meters. A round that penetrated the fuel system and produced ignition in a loaded CH-47 was not a manageable emergency in the time the aircraft's altitude and speed in most operational profiles permitted. CH-47s burned. The crews knew this the way PT boat crews had known their boats burned, not as an abstraction, but as the specific practical knowledge that shaped every decision about fuel state, altitude, and approach angle that the operational environment permitted them to make. The specific incident that makes the general reality of CH-47 operations concrete and irreducible occurred on May 12, 1967, near Quang Tri in E Corps, when a CH-47B from the 228th Aviation Battalion, call sign Hook 21, was assigned to recover a downed UH-1D from a clearing in terrain. The tactical situation had classified as insecure, and that the recovery mission's priority had classified as essential anyway. The UH-1 had gone down the previous afternoon after taking ground fire during a combat assault insertion. Its crew had been extracted by a medevac helicopter within 2 hours, but the airframe was recoverable, repairable at the 1st Cavalry Division's maintenance facility at An Ka if a CH-47 could get it out before the enemy either destroyed it or moved into the clearing in strength sufficient to make the recovery impossible. Hook 21 launched at ZO 6:05 before full daylight, under the reasoning that the reduced visibility would complicate ground fire targeting. The reasoning was not wrong in the abstract. The .51 caliber crew that had been waiting through the night in the tree line south of the clearing had not left. Hook 21 made 2 approaches. The first approach was broken off at 40 feet, when the crew chief reported that the clearing was too confined for the load geometry. The downed UH-1 was oriented in a way that required repositioning before the recovery sling could be attached. The pilot, Warrant Officer 2nd Class Kenneth Ferris of Decatur, Illinois, executed a go-around and made a second approach from the north, a heading that reduced the clearing's geometric problem and increased the southern tree line's shot geometry on the aircraft. The .51 caliber opened on the second approach at approximately 35 feet of hover altitude. The first burst entered the starboard engine pod and the sponson fuel cell. The second burst, fired as Ferris was already pulling pitch for maximum power climb, entered the cockpit from below the instrument panel on the co-pilot's side. The co-pilot, Warrant Officer 2nd Class Robert Hendricks of Columbus, Ohio, was hit in the right shoulder and the right side of the chest by 2 rounds that the subsequent investigation determined had been deflected slightly upward by the cockpit floor structure, a deflection that altered their terminal path enough that Hendricks was grievously wounded rather than killed immediately. Ferris, unhurt, had a cockpit that was filling with smoke from the starboard engine fire, and a co-pilot who was conscious but could not use his right arm at 35 feet of altitude over a clearing. The crew chief was telling him on the interphone they needed to leave right now. Ferris climbed to 200 feet, transmitted a mayday on guard frequency, and flew southeast for 4 minutes and 40 seconds before the starboard engine fire produced a gearbox oil pressure loss that the combining gearbox could not sustain, and the aircraft became uncontrollable. He auto-rotated into a rice paddy 3 kilometers from the clearing. The aircraft rolled partially on its side on touchdown. There was no fire on the ground. The fuel cell damage had been in the self-sealing zone, and the fire had been confined to the engine pod, which had largely burned out during the 4-minute flight. Hendricks was evacuated by medevac helicopter and reached the surgical hospital at Phu Bai alive. He was evacuated to Japan and then to Walter Reed. He survived with permanent loss of function in his right arm. He was medically separated from the Army in 1968. Ferris remained in the Army. He flew CH-47s for the remainder of his first tour and returned for a second tour in 1969, by which time the CH-47C variant, with its more powerful T5 L11 engines producing 3,750 shaft horsepower each, and improved fuel system protection, had replaced the earlier models in most units. He completed his second tour in 1970 with 1,147 total helicopter hours, of which approximately 1,200 were in CH-47s of various variants. The recovery mission for the downed UH-1 that had produced the Hook 21 engagement was completed 3 days later by a different crew under different tactical conditions. The UH-1 was recovered, returned to An Khai, and repaired. It flew again. The operational tempo that CH-47 crews sustained through the peak years of American involvement in Vietnam, 1966 through 1969, was a function of the airmobile concept's requirements and of the specific mathematics of too few aircraft and too many missions that the expansion of the ground war consistently produced. A CH-47 crew at An Khai or Phu Bo or Chu Lai in 1967 was flying between 6 and 10 hours per day during sustained operational periods, which in the Central Highlands and I course during the dry season meant most days. The aircraft required a post-flight inspection after every mission and periodic phase maintenance inspections. At intervals, the operational tempo frequently compressed below the published schedule, not because the maintenance standards were ignored, but because the mission demands and the available aircraft and the published schedule could not always be simultaneously satisfied, and the operational demands were the variable that the chain of command was least willing to reduce. The crew chiefs and flight engineers who maintained CH-47s in Vietnam occupied a position that the aircraft's complexity made uniquely demanding and that the operational tempo made uniquely stressful. A crew chief responsible for a specific aircraft's airworthiness, the individual most directly accountable for whether the aircraft was safe to fly and most directly exposed to the consequences of that judgment being wrong, was making airworthiness calls on aircraft that had flown 8 hours the previous day, been maintained through whatever time was available between last flight and first light, and were needed on the flight line at OS 630 regardless of what the maintenance log showed. The call that the aircraft was ready, made by a 22-year-old specialist, 4 who had been awake since 0400, completing the pre-flight inspection, was not a call made in the conditions that the Army's maintenance doctrine assumed. It was a call made in the conditions the Army's operational requirements produced, which were different. The crew chiefs made those calls because the mission required it, and because the alternative, grounding the aircraft on a judgment that the chain of command would question and that could be wrong in either direction, was a call whose consequences extended beyond the aircraft to the units on the ground waiting for the supplies or the artillery piece or the ammunition that the CH-47 was supposed to deliver. The rotation system that governed CH-47 crew service imposed the same institutional costs on the Chinook units that it imposed on every American combat unit in Vietnam, expressed in the specific terms of a complex aircraft, where crew experience was not a performance modifier, but a survival variable. A CH-47 pilot with 400 hours in country knew things about the aircraft and Vietnam's conditions that a pilot with 40 hours did not know and could not be taught in any formal evolution. The power margin behavior at high-density altitude in the afternoon heat, the specific wind patterns around the Bong Son plain that could put a heavy external load into an oscillation the aircraft could not damp at reduced airspeed, the approach geometry at specific fire support bases that the terrain and the enemy's observed firing positions made preferable to the standard approaches the tactical maps suggested. When that pilot rotated home and was replaced by a pilot with 40 hours, the knowledge rotated with him. The replacement began accumulating it at the cost that inexperience always pays in an environment that does not grade on a curve. The 12-month tour produced a CH-47 force that was continuously cycling through the early portion of the experience curve, never fully green because the aircraft's training requirements and the operational environment's demands filtered out the most dangerous forms of inexperience quickly, but never fully seasoned in the way that a force whose experienced crews remained would have been. The institutional cost of this cycle was paid in the accident and combat loss distribution that the Army's aviation safety records document. Losses concentrated in the early months of individual tours, in units that had recently undergone large-scale crew rotations, in operational periods when the combination of new crews and unfamiliar terrain produced the specific gaps in judgment that experience fills. The psychological environment of CH-47 service differed from the psychological environment of UH-1 or OH-6 service in ways that the aircraft's role and physical character produced rather than any difference in the men who flew them. A UH-1 pilot flying combat assaults was experiencing the threat in a form that was intense, brief, and followed by the decompression of egress from the landing zone at 120 knots. A CH-47 pilot hovering over a fire support base at 4,000 feet of altitude in the highlands, with a 105mm howitzer on the hook, and the approach to the gun position requiring 3 minutes of reduced speed, low-altitude flight over terrain, where the enemy had demonstrated the capability to put effective fire on helicopters. That pilot was experiencing the threat as a sustained condition with no egress option until the load was placed and the hook cleared. The sustained nature of the exposure, repeated across a 12-month tour in which the CH-47's mission requirements reliably produced it, accumulated in ways that the Army Aviation Medicine establishment of the 1960s had not adequately modeled. What the crews developed in the absence of a formal institutional framework for managing sustained operational stress was an informal framework built from the specific culture of the unit, the relationships between pilots, crew chiefs, and gunners that the shared experience of a specific aircraft in a specific environment produced, and that provided the social structure within which the psychological weight of the mission was distributed and managed. The crew chief who had been on an aircraft for 6 months and the pilot who had arrived 3 weeks ago were not equivalent in experience, but they were equivalent in their relationship to the specific risks the mission produced, and that equivalence created a form of mutual accountability. The crew chief's knowledge of the aircraft and the pilot's knowledge of the airspace combined in the specific way that each mission required, that the aircraft's complexity made not merely useful, but essential. This was not described in any Army aviation doctrine. It was what the men built because the aircraft and the mission required it. By 1969 and 1970, as Vietnamization transferred operational responsibility to South Vietnamese units and American CH-47 operations, began the drawdown that would conclude with the last American Chinooks leaving Vietnam in 1972. The crews flying the late war missions were operating in an institutional context that had shifted beneath the tactical realities they were still managing. Units were being deactivated, equipment was being transferred. The organizational structure that had supported CH-47 operations at peak strength was contracting around a mission requirement that had not contracted at a proportional rate. Fewer aircraft, fewer crews, the same terrain, the same enemy, the same requirement to deliver artillery and ammunition to fire support bases that the ground war's pace still demanded. The men who flew through the drawdown carried the specific psychological weight of performing at operational tempo in a shrinking institution, aware that the war was ending in the sense that American participation was ending, aware that the tactical environment had not received the notification that American participation was ending, and managing the distance between those two realities in whatever way the individual personalities and unit cultures of specific CH-47 companies permitted. The homecoming for Army aviators returning from CH-47 service was the homecoming that the era produced. The airports, the uniform, the silence. For warrant officer aviators, who constituted the majority of CH-47 pilots by the late 1960s, as the Army expanded the warrant officer pilot program to meet the war's demand for qualified aviators, the homecoming had an additional institutional dimension. The warrant officer who had flown 1,000 hours in a CH-47 in Vietnam returned to an Army that was actively drawing down its aviation force, and to a civilian aviation market that valued the flight hours and instrument experience, but that was not, in the early 1970s, absorbing Vietnam-era aviators at the rate the drawdown was producing them. The hours were real. The market for them was constrained by the same economic contraction that was absorbing returning Vietnam veterans across every occupational category. They found work the way men find work, through persistence, through the specific marketability of skills that civil aviation recognized, even when the public narrative of the war they had learned those skills in was something the country was trying to move past. One of those men was Chief Warrant Officer 2, David Mercer Hollis of Knoxville, Tennessee. Hollis was 24 years old, When he arrived at the 179th Aviation Company at Phu Bai in January 1968, 3 weeks before the Tet Offensive demonstrated to every Army aviation unit in Third Corps that the operational tempo the previous year had not been the operational tempo the war was capable of producing. He had 312 hours of helicopter time, of which 220 were in CH-47s from his transition training at Fort Rucker. He had never hovered a Chinook with a load on the hook in terrain more complicated than the Alabama coastal plain. He learned what that was like in the first 2 weeks of February 1968, when the 179th was flying combat support missions for Marine and Army units engaged in and around Hue, at a pace that left the crew chiefs performing pre-flight inspections by flashlight and the pilots flying their fourth mission of the day in aircraft that the maintenance logs showed had not completed their scheduled phase inspection. He flew 1,127 hours in CH-47s during his 13 months with the 179th. He recovered 31 downed aircraft, including 4 under fire. He was not wounded. He attributed this, in the specific language of a man who had thought about the attribution carefully enough not to state it casually, to the crew chiefs who kept his aircraft flying, and the door gunners whose suppressive fire during recovery approaches had altered the geometry of situations that the geometry, without alteration, would not have survived. He came home in February 1969 and was hired by Appalachian Power Company in 1971 as a utility helicopter pilot, a job that used the external load skills the Army had built and the CH-47 had refined, moving equipment and conducting line inspections in the terrain of eastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia. He flew for Appalachian Power for 26 years, retiring in 1997 with more than 12,000 total flight hours, of which the first 1,127 were in the machine that had defined what flight meant to him, in the specific terms that only the machine that almost kills you several times can define it. His son, in an account recorded for the Appalachian Power Company's Employee History Project in 2003, described flying with his father once in a small civilian helicopter over the ridgelines of southwestern Virginia, and asking him how it compared to what he had flown in Vietnam. His father was quiet for long enough that the son thought the question had not landed, and then said that it compared the way a conversation compares to an argument. Same language, completely different stakes. He died in 2011 at the age of 67. His logbooks, 6 of them, covering the full span from Fort Rucker to retirement, were donated by his family to the Army Aviation Museum at Fort Novosel, formerly Fort Rucker, where they are maintained in the collection. The first logbook covers January 1967 through February 1969. The entries for the week of the Tet Offensive in February 1968 are made in handwriting noticeably smaller and more compressed than the entries before and after, as if the man writing them was trying to fit more into the space available, or had learned in that particular week that the space available was something you could not assume would always be there. Did you know someone who served in Vietnam? A father, an uncle, a neighbor who came back different? What did they tell you, or what did they never say? Share below.